So in this video we're going to finish the project off, and we're going to start by doing some texturing. Now the one thing that's missing from this scene at the moment is a wake in the ocean. Now although we've got a wake generated by the particles immediately around the boat, as the boat would move across the water it would leave a wake or a trail of foam behind it. So what we're going to do is apply a texture to the ocean and then mask that texture, and then the boat is going to drag that mask around. So just go over to the render tab. Now at the moment I've got a clay material over everything here in the shader tree, so I'm just going to right click and delete that. That's going to take a couple of seconds to kick in because of the displacement on the ocean. Now whilst I'm actually working, there's no need for me to actually see the displacement in preview, so I'm just going to go to options and turn displacements off, and now the update should be a lot quicker. Now in order to see exactly what's going on, I'm going to need to look down at the boat from above. So we're going to need another camera in the scene. So I'll create a camera, and in the 3D viewport here I'll just zoom out. So I'm looking down. And then in the preview renderer I'll just choose camera 3. So the first thing to do is to get the texture onto the ocean. So in the ocean material mask here, I'm just going to add layer, textures. I'm just going to add a standard noise texture over the top. Now to go to the texture locator, I'm going to reduce the size to 500 millimeters. Now at the moment that noise texture is completely covering the ocean, and it's a combination of white and black. So the only bit of it we're really interested in is the white, and we want the blue of the ocean to come through. So with the texture selected, come to texture layers, and I'm just going to reduce the alpha for color 1 down to 0. Now it would also be nice to have this texture animated, because the foam would be boiling away after the boat had passed. So to do that I'm just going to check flow noise, and then I'm going to key the flow phase. I'll open that up in the graph editor, and I'll just go to about frame 200, create another key, set the value of that to 1, and then the pre and post behaviors to linear. So the next thing to do is to apply the mask. Now I've already loaded the image map in here. Just double click on it so you can take a look at it. So I'm just going to apply that into the top of the ocean mask. Now the reason why we can't see anything is because if we go to the texture locator it's being applied via a UV map. So I'm just going to change that to be planar on the Y. Now at the moment that image is being tiled across the entire ocean. So the next thing I want to do is scale the texture so that one tile is the correct size. So I've already worked this out, so it's going to be 28 meters by 40 meters on the Y and 40 meters on the Z. So the next thing to do is to make sure that this texture is in exactly the same position and orientation as the boat. So to do that we need to first select the mask texture locator, and then I can hold down Control and select Trawler Mover. Then I'm going to bring up the setup palette, which is F4, and I want to match the position and also the rotation. So then we can go back to the texture locator for the mask, and we need to change the horizontal and vertical repeat to edge. And you'll see there that the wake is actually on the wrong side of the boat. It's like the boat is going backwards. So under rotation Y for the texture locator, I'm just going to type in minus 180. So to use that image map to mask the noise texture, all we have to do is drag and drop it onto the noise layer. And you can see now we get the ocean around the boat, and we just get this area of noise behind it. So to get that mask to then follow the boat, all we need to do is select the texture locator for the mask and then just drag and drop it onto the item that's animated, which is the trawler mover local. So we'll just drop that on there, and then if I scrub forward in the animation, you can see that the texture is following the boat. Alternatively, because the boat is travelling in a straight line and also at a constant velocity, you could just animate the Z position channel to match the boat. So the next thing to do is texture the particles themselves. So we'll start with the wake, and again I want this to render fairly quickly, and again we're only creating an impression of spray and foam. So what I'm going to do is just use a sprite without any image map applied to it. So I'll just drag and drop that into the schematic. Now I'm going to set the radius. I'm going to set the radius to 200 millimeters, and then I'm just going to hook it up to the wake cache. And once I do that, preview should update. There we go. And you can see how that's creating this kind of impression of foam going around the boat. So to get those particles to blend more with the ocean, I'm going to change the colour of them based on their age. So if we come down to shading, set with the RGBA gradient input set to particle age, I'm just going to open up the graph editor, and I'm going to create a key at 20%. So when the particles are first created, I want them to be the same colour as the ocean. So let's create a dark blue. And then when they're a little bit older, I want them then to blend into a white or a very light blue. So next we can do something similar with the spray. So again, I'm going to load in a sprite, drag that into the schematic. Now with the spray, we're hardly going to see it, what with motion blur and everything else going on in the animation. So I'm going to drop the radius down to 50 millimeters and then hook that up to the other cache. So I just brought back the displacement in preview, and if you look closely you can see the sprites for the spray simulation in the foreground there. Now when it comes to actually outputting this animation, there are two ways we can go. If you just want to render it straight out of Modo, then what we could do is go to the camera. We could activate some depth of field, maybe reduce the f-stop to 0.5 so we've got a bit of blur in the foreground. We might want some motion blur. And then to increase the quality of the shading, we go to the base shader and reduce the shading rate down to 0.5. And then because we're using depth of field, we need to increase the samples. So if I go to the render layer and to settings, I can increase the anti-aliasing to 64 samples per pixel. So if you then hit render and save it as a TIFF sequence, you should end up with something like this. So the problem with rendering an animation out this way is you don't have much control over it afterwards. So alternatively, you might want to render it out so you can do some compositing in a program like Nuke. If that's the case, then we need to set the scene up slightly differently. So first of all, there are things we don't need to render. So if we select the camera, we don't need to render depth of field and motion blur because they can all be applied in post. So I'll switch those off. And we also don't need to render any of the fog because again that can be applied in post. So we go to the base shader and I'll turn off fog. So what we need to do next is add a number of render outputs that break the render apart. Then we can reconstruct the render inside of the compositing application so we can control various aspects of it. So if I just duplicate the final color output, right click on effect, the first thing that we need is diffuse shading total. If I right click and duplicate that again, we also need reflection shading. And we need specular shading. And also luminous shading. So in order to recreate the depth of field, we need a depth output. And in order to recreate the motion blur, we need a motion vector output. Now, the diffuse shading total doesn't include any volumetrics. So to see the color of the volumetrics, we need to include a volumetric scattering output. And it'll also be helpful to isolate certain aspects of the image so we can work on those areas separately. And we can do that with alpha outputs. So we'll probably need to isolate the volumetrics, the boat and the ocean. So if I select the alpha output, to isolate the volumetrics, just right click and choose volumetric opacity. And if I duplicate that and change that to an alpha output, to isolate the ocean, I can just drop that into the ocean mask. And then if I create another alpha output, I can drop that into the trawler to isolate that. Now you can add as many of these render outputs as you want. It really depends what you want to control in post. Now you can preview exactly what these outputs are going to give you in preview renderer here. So for example, that alpha will give me the boat, and that one the ocean. Volumetric scattering will give me the color of the volumetrics, motion vector output, depth output. And we've got a problem with the depth output here. What we need to do is remap its depth. So if we select the depth output, check remap pixel values, and I'll just set the maximum depth to 400 meters. So when you're happy with your render outputs, you can render it and save it as an EXR sequence. And then you can load that sequence into a program like Nuke and take what is quite a flat image and bring it to life